In a forgotten corner of Texas, there's a small grocery store with no flashy signs, no social media, and no discounts. Just one man behind the counter and decades of quiet service. Most people walked past it without a second glance until one simple act of kindness turned it into the center of a storm. What started as a silent gesture sparked a viral controversy, and then something no one expected happened. Military trucks, a general, a truth long buried. It all began with a hungry mother, a handful of coins, and a man who refused to turn her away. This is the story of Michael Carrington and how the world finally saw the man it had long overlooked. Let's begin. Michael Carrington was 58 years old and had spent the last 20 years quietly running a modest grocery store in a forgotten corner of a struggling Texas neighborhood. His storefront was simple: no glowing signs, no advertisements, no flashy window displays, just a faded wooden board with Carrington's Market painted in chipped, stubborn letters. It stood like a relic of another time, ignored by many, cherished by few. He didn't need gimmicks to keep his store alive. Reputation and quiet decency had been his only currency. Over the years, neighbors came and went, businesses closed down, sidewalks cracked and sagged, but Michael's store remained. It wasn't much, just 5 narrow aisles and a humming fridge in the back, but it had heart. The kind of place where your name mattered more than your wallet. Michael knew his customers better than most knew their own family. He remembered whose daughter had allergies, which elderly man preferred his tomatoes soft, and who always counted out change with a shaking hand and quiet apology. He never judged, he simply nodded, bagged the items, and wished them a good day. On Thursday afternoon, as the sun sagged toward the horizon and shadows crawled across the worn linoleum floor, the bell above the door jingled softly. A young woman stepped inside, holding the hands of 2 children, a boy and a girl, both under 10, both dressed in clothes that had been outgrown and outworn. Their faces were wide-eyed, not with excitement, but with a familiar kind of hunger that didn't need words. Michael watched quietly as the mother moved through the store with deliberate care. She picked up a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a few bruised apples. Items chosen with the precision of someone who'd done this calculation far too often. At the counter, she opened her palm and began counting coins, her eyes narrowing, lips tight with anxiety. She paused, counted again and again. The total came to $24.63. She had $18.75. I'm so sorry, she said softly, already starting to pull the fruit from the counter. Maybe just the bread and eggs. Michael said nothing, but he noticed the way the little girl gripped her brother's hand when the apples were set aside. He saw the boy glance away, pretending not to care, pretending he didn't see the cookies on the shelf or feel the weight in his mother's chest. Michael gently slid the items back into a paper bag and then added the apples again. Without a word, he opened the cooler and pulled out a carton of milk. He paused, then reached for a box of chocolate chip cookies the children had been staring at earlier. He placed them into the bag, folded the top, and pushed it across the counter. We don't charge hunger prices here, he said gently. The mother froze, her eyes already misted over. I can't accept that. Michael looked her in the eyes and said, You don't need to explain. But she did anyway, not because he asked, but because some part of her needed to say it aloud. My husband just got discharged, she whispered. He's been looking for work, but his mother's in the hospital, bills are piling up, and it's just been hard. Michael nodded once, not as a question, not as pity, but as quiet understanding. Behind her in line, a man rolled his eyes and muttered loudly, What is this place now, a charity center? Thought this was a store, not a soup kitchen. The words hung in the air like smoke. The woman flinched. The children shifted closer to her legs. Michael didn't look up. He just wiped the counter with a cloth that had cleaned more than just surfaces over the years. He moved with calm, practiced hands, the way someone does when they've seen worse and survived it. The woman gathered the bag and her children, whispered, Thank you, and walked out swiftly, her head high for the kids, even if her heart was still bowed. The man behind her pulled out his phone, typing angrily, his thumbs jabbing the screen like the store owed him something more than groceries. That night, after the last customer left and the fluorescent lights dimmed, Michael locked the front door and stood for a long moment in the quiet. The aisles were still. Outside, the street lamp flickered in the growing dark. He walked to the counter, reached up behind it, and ran his fingers across a small bronze medal, a military commendation nestled among faded photos of a life few people asked about. His expression didn't change. He didn't smile. He didn't cry, but in his eyes there were decades of stories sealed tight behind silence. Stories of sacrifice, of duty, whew, of promises made in deserts far away. Stories no one ever asked him to tell. And still, he chose to give. And by the next morning, the damage had already begun. A video had surfaced online, grainy footage taken by the angry man in line, captioned with venom, local store owner enabling freeloaders, killing honest business. Within hours, the post had spread like wildfire through local social media. The comment section boiled over with judgment. People like him ruin neighborhoods. Bet he gives away more than groceries. Won't be surprised if that place gets robbed next. Among the noise were a few kind voices defending what they'd seen, but they were quickly drowned out by the louder, meaner ones. A local influencer reposted it to his 30,000 followers with a smirking caption, "Get your free food while it lasts, courtesy of St. Michael." That day, the regulars didn't come. The old men who used to buy coffee and talk about the cowboys stood across the street, hands in their pockets. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had come in every Thursday for 15 years, crossed to the other side of the road to avoid passing the storefront. When Michael looked up and caught her eye through the glass, she turned away, pretending not to see him. Inside, the store was colder than usual. Shelves were full, but the air felt empty. Around noon, Thomas Jensen walked in, a slick-talking acquaintance from the local business association. He leaned against the counter, speaking in a hushed tone like he was sharing a secret. "Mike, I know you mean well," he began, "but this bleeding heart thing, it doesn't work anymore. People don't appreciate it, they take advantage." Michael restocked cans in silence. "Listen," Thomas pressed, "you're running a business, not a shelter. Doing the right thing's fine, but it doesn't pay the rent. Right isn't always practical, you know." Michael didn't argue. He simply said, "I'm not trying to save everyone, Tom. Just doing what feels right." Thomas sighed, pushing off the counter. "Times change. You've got to adapt before they eat you alive." When he left, Michael turned up the volume on his ancient radio. A Johnny Cash song filled the room, the crackle of the speaker comforting in its imperfection. He hummed along, voice low and rough, and returned to the quiet work of keeping his little world intact. That evening, a delivery driver Michael had known for over a decade pulled into the alley, but didn't unload the usual shipment. He walked in, eyes apologetic. "Sorry, Mike," he muttered. "The company's pulling our deliveries for now." Said something about that video, bad optics. Michael nodded, without surprise. "I didn't agree," the driver added quickly. "For what it's worth, my old man was a Marine. He would have done the same." Michael looked up, the briefest flicker of emotion crossing his face. "I noticed your medal once," the driver continued. "Didn't bring it up. Figured if you wanted to talk, you would have." After he left, the store felt heavier. Michael sat alone at the small desk in his back office, surrounded by old invoices and shelves lined with canned beans and cleaning supplies. He picked up a pen and wrote a simple letter, one line at a time, with the same slow care he used when labeling the peanut butter shelf. He walked to the front of the store and taped it to the door. "To my valued customers, if my actions have caused discomfort or confusion, I take full responsibility. This store was built to serve with dignity. That mission will not change." Then he locked up and headed home. Michael's apartment was just 3 blocks away, nestled above a laundromat. As he sat on his small balcony that night, the rumble of washing machines below blended with the distant hum of crickets. The street was still, quiet. From his pocket, he pulled out a small bronze medal, identical to the one in the store. He ran his thumb over its surface, each groove and ridge as familiar as breathing. His eyes didn't move, but his mind drifted far. From Texas to the blazing heat of desert soil, to the chaos of distant gunfire, to names and faces that only existed now in memory. He remembered moments when tomorrow wasn't promised. He remembered what it felt like to hold pressure on a friend's wound while helicopters circled too far away. He remembered refusing to leave. Many had turned away from him these past few days, but he would not turn away from what was right. Not now. Not after everything. If a gesture of kindness made others uncomfortable, so be it. He would keep showing up, even if no one else did. By dawn, silence still hung heavy over the neighborhood, but something unusual stirred it from slumber. The low rumble of diesel engines shattered the morning stillness. One by one, military transport vehicles began lining the street in front of Michael's store. Their presence, out of place among faded porches and cracked sidewalks, drew curtains open and sent neighbors onto front lawns with confusion etched across their faces. No one had seen anything like it. Some whispered it was a raid, others feared it was the final nail in the store's coffin, an official shutdown or public reprimand. But what followed was not confrontation, it was ceremony. Uniformed men and women stepped from the vehicles in perfect formation. Their boots struck the pavement with a rhythm that commanded silence. Among them was a young woman whose face many recognized, the same woman who had entered the store just days earlier, with 2 hungry children and a trembling voice. She now wore her military uniform with solemn grace, ribbons and bars catching the sun, standing alongside her husband, himself dressed in ceremonial blues, posture rigid with honor. Their children, once dressed in second-hand clothes, now wore clean, pressed outfits and solemn expressions, trying to understand the gravity of what they were part of. Behind them stood a man whose presence shifted the atmosphere entirely. Older, tall, with silver hair and 3 stars on his shoulder, his every step toward the store stirred awe in those watching. The air was thick, not with tension, but with reverence. Michael remained behind the counter as the group entered. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But something in his stillness suggested he understood, on some level, why they were there. The older man approached him with the formal bearing of someone who had lived a life measured in duty and loss. He offered a handshake and spoke words that carried the weight of history. He identified Michael by his full rank and name, recalling a moment long buried by time, a battlefield in Somalia 30 years earlier. There, a man had stayed behind under fire, refusing orders to retreat, working through the night to keep the wounded alive. That man was Michael. What had once been known to only a few was now spoken aloud, and with that revelation came a wave of stunned recognition. The general had been one of the soldiers saved in that siege. His voice, steady yet marked by emotion, honored a debt that had never been paid. Not out of neglect, but because the man who earned it had never sought recognition. The woman, the same one who had once counted coins at the counter, had recognized the medal in Michael's store. Her husband, upon hearing the description, had known the name immediately. Word had spread from soldier to soldier, across units and years, until they had come together, all for one reason: to stand with a man who had once stood alone. Outside, the skeptical crowd that had come expecting scandal found themselves bearing witness to something else entirely. The story they thought they knew unraveled in front of them, revealing layers of sacrifice, silence, and quiet honor. The veterans began to approach Michael one by one, saluting him with the precision of warriors, and he returned each gesture, not with pride, but with something quieter: duty remembered, connection reclaimed. Neighbors began to lower their phones. Some wiped their eyes. Even those who had crossed the street the day before now crossed it again, but this time toward the store, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Throughout the afternoon, the small store transformed. People didn't come in to shop, they came to acknowledge. An elderly man brought a faded photograph from a forgotten war. A boy handed Michael a crayon colored card that simply said he wanted to grow up to be like him. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had once turned away, returned with a plate of empanadas and an apology in her downcast eyes. Michael did not seek the spotlight, and when the news crew arrived, he declined interviews. For him, it was never about recognition. It was about remembering that doing the right thing should not need explanation. Even Thomas, the businessman who had advised him to adapt or fade, returned with 2 cups of coffee and an awkward smile that spoke louder than words. And the man who had filmed the video, the one who'd turned the store into a battleground online, returned too. He deleted the post in full view of everyone and admitted his mistake, not with eloquence, but with the quiet surrender of someone who had finally seen the truth. Michael remained steady through it all, one hand resting on the bronze medal now displayed proudly behind the counter. His eyes, as always, were calm, but for the first time in years, the corners of his mouth curved into something gentle. A smile, small and certain. Later, when the crowd began to thin and the sun dipped low, the general returned for one final gesture. He handed Michael a perfectly folded American flag, the same way it would be handed to a family at a funeral, only this time it was not in mourning, it was in gratitude. Some people spend a lifetime never asking for praise. They give and give again and disappear into the background of the world. But sometimes, just once, they are seen. And when they are, it reminds everyone else that kindness is not weakness. It is a legacy. As the sun began to fall behind the rooftops and the last golden rays stretched across the pavement, the streets slowly returned to stillness. The armored trucks rolled away one by one, their engines humming like the final notes of a solemn hymn. The crowd lingered a moment longer, some holding hands, some wiping their eyes, but most simply stood in silence, unsure how to leave a moment that had changed them. Inside the store, Michael continued his quiet work. The shelves were slightly out of order from the unusual traffic, and the floor held footprints of polished boots and worn sneakers alike. He moved through the narrow aisles with calm purpose, as if the events of the day had been both extraordinary and somehow already part of his world. He restocked a shelf with canned soup. He realigned a stack of cereal boxes. Then he paused, not from exhaustion, but from something softer, a fullness that settled not in the body, but in the spirit. It had been many years since someone had looked at him and seen beyond the apron and the tired eyes. Yet the truth was, he had never stopped looking out for others. Quietly, consistently, without fanfare. He placed the folded American flag on a shelf behind the counter, beside the medal that had once been hidden from view. They sat together now, not as symbols of ego, but as reminders, for himself more than anyone, that a life lived in quiet service had not gone unseen. That evening, Michael closed the store not with weariness, but with a strange sense of peace. He walked home along the same sidewalk he had taken every day for years. But now the street felt different. Neighbors who once turned away now nodded as he passed. A boy on a porch raised his hand in a shy wave. A woman smiled, not with politeness, but with genuine warmth. In the laundry room beneath his apartment, the machines still rumbled, spinning and tumbling cloth through the cycles of ordinary life. From his balcony above, Michael sat watching the glow of porch lights flicker across the block. The metal in his pocket felt lighter now, not because its weight had changed, but because it no longer had to carry its story alone. He thought of the mother who had returned, not in need, but in purpose. He thought of the children who had looked at cookies like distant stars and how their eyes had changed when someone showed them they mattered. He thought of soldiers he had held together with gauze and grit, and of promises that had lasted longer than war. There had been a time when he believed silence was the noblest choice, to serve, to give, and then to disappear. But now he understood that while humility was strength, sometimes the world needed to see the quiet ones, not for their applause, but to remember what dignity looked like. In the days that followed, customers returned not because they needed groceries, but because they needed to feel close to something true. Cards and letters were slipped through the door. Veterans he had never met stopped by just to shake his hand. Children came in, not to ask for candy, but to sit quietly near the counter, as if hoping something about his presence might stay with them. The man who had once filmed him in bitterness came back again, not for forgiveness, though it was offered without being asked, because he had discovered something humbling in the mirror of his misjudgment. Even Thomas returned, not with advice this time, but with a broom and a quiet gesture to sweep the floor. And Michael let them, not because he needed the help, but because legacy is not built alone. It lives in the way others carry the weight with you when they finally understand what you've been carrying all along. He never changed the sign above the store. He never raised prices, never made speeches, never sought recognition. But he left the medal where people could see it now, not as a badge of honor, but as a quiet invitation to remember that in every neighborhood, on every corner, there is someone who gives more than they take, who holds the line even when no one's looking. And somewhere in the heart of that dusty old store, beneath the hum of the coolers and the creak of wooden shelves, kindness kept working, one quiet act at a time. In the weeks that followed, life returned to the neighborhood, but not in the way it had been before. Something beneath the surface had shifted. People greeted each other with more intention. They slowed down. They looked longer into one another's eyes before passing, as if the silent man behind the grocery counter had quietly reminded everyone that decency was never outdated, that kindness, even when overlooked, was never wasted. Children began stopping by the store after school, not always to buy something, but sometimes just to sit on the stoop and listen to stories Michael rarely told. He didn't offer advice, he didn't entertain with flair, but the kids leaned in anyway, listening not just to his words, but to the pauses between them, the weight of what had been lived and endured without ever being said. Some wrote essays about him for school assignments, others drew pictures of the little store and taped them to the glass window. A local teacher asked if she could bring students by once a week, not for a history lesson, but for something quieter. A chance to witness steadiness, to see that heroism didn't always arrive in uniforms or on breaking news segments. Even the sign above the store with its chipped paint and fading letters started to mean something different to people. What once had been overlooked now stood as a symbol, not of nostalgia, but of resilience. Michael never sought to capitalize on the attention. He declined interviews from national outlets and turned down offers for sponsorships and speaking engagements. His story had never been a brand. It was just a life, lived with integrity, guided by a compass that never sought reward. But in the quiet, his influence grew. The young woman he had once helped started volunteering at the community clinic. Her husband began mentoring other veterans trying to re-enter civilian life. The man who had publicly shamed him online took a job delivering food to seniors, driving the same streets where he had once chosen pride over understanding. And Thomas, the businessman who had once advised him to play it safe, started a fund to help other small businesses that chose principle over profit. None of them claimed Michael had changed them, and he never asked for credit, but something about his steadiness had become a mirror for others, a standard, a reminder of what it looked like to choose quiet courage over noisy judgment. On Sundays, Michael would sit on the bench just outside his store with a cup of black coffee, watching the street breathe around him. Sometimes people joined him, sometimes they didn't, but always the bench was there. The coffee was warm, in his presence, solid, undemanding, real, was enough. Some evenings after closing up, he would walk to the edge of the neighborhood where the city lights thinned and the sky opened wide. He'd stand still for a while, hands in his coat pockets, eyes on the stars, not searching for anything, just remembering. Remembering friends who didn't come home, remembering promises made in the middle of chaos, remembering that while the world often forgot, he would not. And perhaps because of that, others would remember too. They would remember that character is not built when people are watching, but when no one is. That generosity is most powerful when it asks for nothing in return. That even a man with no headlines, no followers, and no spotlight can change everything if he simply refuses to stop doing what is right. The grocery store stayed open, not because of revenue or fame, but because it had become something else, a landmark of quiet defiance, a monument not to the man inside, but to the idea he embodied. And every so often, someone new would come in, not because they were hungry for food, but because they had heard the story, a story whispered from porch to porch, from classroom to coffee shop, about a man who once gave too much and expected nothing. And when they arrived, they would see him, tired eyes, worn apron, hands marked by time, and understand without needing to be told. They were standing in a place where kindness was not a strategy. It was simply the way things were. Part 6. What was left behind. Years passed quietly, as they tend to do in places where time doesn't rush. The small grocery store remained on its corner, stubborn as ever against storms, heat waves, and chain retailers that came and went like seasonal trends. The sign above the door faded further, but no one ever suggested repainting it. The chipped lettering had become part of its soul, unassuming, grounded, real. Michael kept working, though slower with each season. His hands, once steady and precise, now carried the tremble of age, but he refused help, not out of pride, but out of rhythm. His life had been built on small, repeatable actions, wiping counters, restocking shelves, making change, not just for bills, but for people. He never called himself a veteran, never introduced himself with stories of war or sacrifice. That was not the language he used. Instead, he spoke through gesture, through consistency, through the quiet belief that some things, dignity, humility, grace, should never go out of style. Neighbors began noticing how the world outside the store moved faster than the one within it. While the city grew noisier and less personal, Michael's store remained untouched. Children who had once sat on the stoop returned as adults with their own kids, passing on the same stories they had once overheard. Some still pointed to the photograph of the folded flag framed next to the metal. They whispered its meaning to their children, not out of duty, but reverence. Eventually, the day came when the shutters stayed closed longer than usual. A sign appeared, handwritten and brief, taped to the inside of the glass. Closed today, back tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. Michael had passed away in his sleep, alone but not forgotten. The news spread slowly at first, carried in soft voices down hallways, across porches, into mailboxes. And then it grew, like memory often does when it finally demands space. The funeral was quiet as he would have wanted. No speeches, no pageantry, just people, all kinds of people. Neighbors, veterans, children now grown, and strangers who had only heard whispers of the man with tired eyes and an apron stained with years. They came not to mourn a store owner, but to honor a standard, a way of being. Afterward, someone unlocked the door to Carrington's market. The lights buzzed on, dust hung in the sunbeams. Everything was still in place. A notebook remained on the counter with names and totals scrawled inside. Not debts, but gestures. things he had covered just for now that were never asked to be repaid. No one claimed ownership, but no one let it die. In the weeks that followed, a group of locals reopened the store, not as a business, but as a community space. They left the shelves half stocked and free. Kids could come in for a snack. Seniors could take what they needed. Volunteers kept it running, not for profit, but because it felt right. Because the space carried something that could not be priced. They renamed it quietly Carrington's Honor, but most still just called it Mike. Teachers brought students there to talk about values. Veterans met monthly for coffee at the same corner table. And in the back, where the light fell just right in the afternoons, they kept a small display, a folded flag, a faded photo, a bronze medal, and a sign underneath carved in simple wood. Think, never ask to be remembered. That's why we always will. Years from now, the name might fade again. The paint may peel, but the echoes will remain in the kindness offered without question, in the courage shown without applause, in the small, stubborn hope that one man's quiet life could still change 100 others. And in a little store on a dusty street, that legacy lives on. Song in stone, budding people.